I don't know how to address Rob's kicking big data in the nuts yesterday. I missed it. However, it happens almost every day. And I'm not really going to spend a lot of time talking about big data itself or technologies like that, but how this kind of all fits together and some of the trends that are driving kind of the next generation of marketing activities. So last night got here, I had like 120 slides. I think I've got it down to something reasonable. So these are going to go fast. If anybody wants to stop me, please do. That's my kind of the first part of my intro. The second part is, I don't know if does everybody know who Accenture is? Like, we're a big company, big consultancy. But Accenture Interactive, within Accenture, there's a lot of tribes, and we're one of those tribes. We're focused on the digital marketing space. We focus on the CMO's agenda. We work with marketing organizations all over the world, everything from DMPs to site optimization to ad campaigns. And we have like this practice built around trying to drive analytics and technology throughout marketing. We released a consumer technology study. We have a bunch of different studies, but one of that, I think, if you notice on the previous slide, we didn't have a search practice, but when you look at, when we go out and do surveys, what do people use the most, which is search. And I'm a big, search is probably what I do 95% of the time, because I don't have any answers, but I am like a total search outsider. Originally, my boss, Craig McDonald, was supposed to be here today, and Craig came from Bing. He was VP of marketing for Bing, and he was at Google, and he had like this search insider presentation. I'm like, well, I'm a search outsider. And when I was thinking about this weekend, I was out for a ride on Sunday, where it was actually, I live from Colorado, and it was like 78 degrees. And everywhere else I've been, I was in Georgia yesterday, I was in Florida today, it's a little bit cooler. I'm like, it's a little upside down. But I was out for a ride, and I got to this part on the ride, and it's like this 65 feet of just rocks. And there's no way I'm going to ride that. It's not going to happen. I can't ride up it. I can't ride down it. So I know I'm carrying my bike. But then, as I was standing there, some guy comes whipping down. There's like this log roll. He comes riding down there. He gets to the bottom. He jumps over the last like 15 feet of rocks. And I was like, oh, that's how you do it. And that's how I feel kind of talking to this group about search, which is, I know a lot about digital marketing, but when it comes to search and search activities, you guys are like that guy on his bike just flying over the parts of it that I can't even comprehend. So when I think about search, looking at like kind of like search in general, like everything in that search box, you guys are experts on. Where I practice is in the kind of white space around that search box. So what I've been doing for the past few years is looking at ways that companies can bring data from all over the internet and other channels and bring it into their systems. About 5 years ago, nobody was bringing in all the data that was being created in search or social, digital marketing, even email campaigns and things like that were just ignored. Everybody in the marketing department ran either those were specific channels with their own data, or they had their own internal data that they were bringing together. After capturing the data, really kind of driving, how do you drive analysis out of that data? So how does this data kind of fit together between search and social, or even if I wanted to connect offline campaigns and online campaigns? And how do I bring data together so I can drive analysis that I can get lift in these different channels? So after you kind of bring the data together, you have to kind of create some algorithms and push those algorithms back up into the channels so that you can align your marketing organization to go after that capability. And that is where I've been focused on when I think about the search space, which is what's the data that drives search forward? What search data can be used to empower the rest of the marketing? And then what are some of this kind of race to context between with social, mobile, and search, because that is going to be the area that's most important in 3 years of this kind of contextual search, or contextual marketing that combines search, mobile, and social. So that's what I'm going to be spending the rest of the time talking about. Now, I have a hypothesis. I don't know whether this is fair, but that when you look at the search engines, Google and Bing and others, they can monetize their research into search technologies across billions of dollars and trillions of impressions, and they can really get a lot of value out of that data. Whereas if you're in a company, no matter what size company, you have a request to do analytics, and it's based on millions of dollars and maybe millions of clicks, but it's really a big disparity between the two. But I think with big data, that's going to change. And the reason I hate the idea of everybody kind of poo-poos big data. I had this conversation on the plane yesterday, and it was like, what is it? Who cares? It's really not that. What I want to talk about today is some of the analytical techniques that really originated with the search engine companies and are now being brought into companies around the world. And the technologies and the people and the methodologies that are going to they're transforming how companies are driving driving search and social and marketing in general within the company, because they're really rethinking how they do business. So, in thinking about how to address this, and I tried to put some structure around this discussion. But when you think about like the consumer purchase, people are going through this kind of process, and it doesn't matter what channels they're touching, but this is the typical kind of path to purchase, which is I have a need. Somehow I became aware that I need something or want something. I seek that product. I look at the different things I could have. I buy, and then theoretically I enjoy. I'm not really sure if you actually enjoy, because that whole cycle starts again as soon as you buy something. As soon as you buy your phone, as soon as you buy your car, you start thinking about the next thing you want to buy. But that really I want to use this just as a framework for kind of discussing some of these topics. And in terms of search, search typically fits in that kind of, when I seek value, I'm thinking I want to get something, or I've become aware of something because I've searched on it. Now I might become more aware because of the search results, but I'm focused, I start thinking about seek. And what I like about that is search, really is this kind of glue that ties things together. Whether it's offline campaigns or online campaigns, at some point, most consumers are going to go through that search phase, and then they'll act. And then if they buy online, we can really connect that search to the buying online. If they are using offline channels, it's harder to kind of connect those dots. You just see maybe some search impressions. So when we've been thinking about this, and about the data that's involved in there, and how do you tie these things together, and I want to kind of just spend one more second. So when I do, one thing that we haven't worked with clients on is, as I start lining up this data, if I want to measure the impact of a TV campaign or a local media buy, and I want to see how that affects my store traffic, or I want to see what is the activity that's going to happen. One of the first places I can look is search activity, because as soon as I put an ad out there, I've created that impression. Typically, people are going to search. If I see a bus drive by with something that I become aware of, I might search on that. And I can see a lift in markets where I've done advertising and where I haven't. And the first place I'll usually see that is in my search. And if I can map people who search, and even if they're going to an offline store, and if I see searches that end on a map page, I can tie that to it. Again, I'm not trying to tie together every piece of the chain in this analysis. I'm trying to tie together the chain. So what we've been doing is really kind of breaking out the data from all the different online channels and offline channels, and starting to be able to tie it together. Now, the easiest place to tie things together is time. I was working with a client, and they ran a spot Super Bowl ad, and they blew out their search budget, and they almost burned out their web servers because people, for some reason, are watching the Super Bowl and suddenly they wanted to buy betting. I don't know why. But those types, but if you look at timing, you can see those connections. So tying your data together based on time is one of the first ways that you can bring kind of cohesiveness to your marketing campaigns, no matter what the channel is. The second is place. And when you're in the search space, you're thinking, search typically has the ability to do kind of geolocation and get down to really fine levels of granularity. But we think about a lot of the other channels as being mass advertising. But most TV ad buys have a big local component to them. All newspaper advertising is basically local. Almost all radio advertising is local. You get to bus wrappers, you get to outdoor, it's all very local. So being able to tie trends together using place is another way of doing that. When we get into campaigns and the actual text strings, it becomes a little bit more difficult, but we're seeing more technology that's opening the doors for tying these together. I kind of leave off kind of like the visits and the customers, because then you're down to like really trying to get a mass piece down to a customer, that we can tie customer information together from these different channels in a lot of different ways. Not necessarily in placement data, but in when I get to people who came to my site, and I can tie them together over multiple visits. So before I get to kind of like the big data piece of this, I think some of the questions that we've seen clients asking are things like, if I have a supply chain disruption, how should that affect my search? Can I programmatically affect search? This kind of question came up with a client who was impacted they sold solid state drives, and they were impacted by the floods in Thailand, and their marketing department was still pushing solid state drives in search, and they were paying, they had their campaign geared around solid state drives. They couldn't get any solid state drives out of Thailand. So they had this disruption in their supply chain. If you could automate that process of what's coming through the supply chain to what you have in search, you can then theoretically optimize it or not spend money trying to sell things you don't have to people. Some of the other questions, like how does search get credit for offline sales? And we've worked with clients to tie together search-originated visits to certain endpoints that then show their influence in the store, because we could then tie maybe a loyalty card to a purchase. I was working with an outdoor company, and they had this whole kind of case study around selling guns, but you can't sell guns online. They don't sell guns online. You have to go to the store. So they wanted to see how they could track firearm sales that started with search and then ended up in the store. And they would tie them together through their loyalty card because they would authenticate their customers. When you're talking about mass advertising and the lift, another way to do that is just, as I talked a little bit about search and looking at your search and the different advertising campaigns. But I think, one of the big areas I'm going to talk about is this idea of time and structuring your data across time. So how do I see search strings changing over time? If I have a single customer and it's a large purchase, their search strings may become more descriptive over time. I may be able to place them at a different point in the buy cycle than when they first started. Another area that is interesting that I'm working with a client on now is they're looking at trying to do call avoidance in their call center. And we want to analyze how people talk about their experience. So when they search, they come into the website, they're trying to solve a problem. They end up at an agent. That's a very expensive outcome for this customer, for the company, because they didn't solve the person's problem online. If we can mine the text in the customer agent notes or in the phone call and match it to what people are actually searching for, you might actually change your landing pages. You can change the path that those customers are coming through, because you've seen that maybe the way you talk about it in your site is not the way customers are thinking about it. And the companies become enamored with the way they think about their processes. Another one is which kind of search terms and keywords and strings are tied to longer customer lifecycle versus just conversion. So as we look at customers over time, we can tie back we can start clustering around different types of search interactivity and then tie that to different outcomes in the customer lifecycle. And we can start to map all this information together using some of the visualization tools that have been kind of coming out in the big data space. And that's going to be a key. So when we start thinking about these questions, I wanted to kind of tee those up before I got into the big data kind of analytics piece. So I've been doing this type of analysis and work with customers for about 5 years. And when I first started doing it, it was really impossible. You could do it, but I think as Stephen writes, and I use this line a lot, anything's within walking distance if you have the time. We would put IT departments through crazy steps in order to be able to tie together like search and social and online marketing and offline marketing. And the reason for that is the data that was coming from the online sites was completely different than how these companies were used to using it. And it was different in a number of ways. So from the data that was inside the firewall, they controlled. If I wanted to make a change to my point of sale system, I could code that. I knew when it was going to be released, and I coded the analytics into that. The data that was being created outside the firewall, I had no control over that. Facebook can change their Graph API anytime they want. All these different technologies can change at any moment, and if I'm an IT department, I'm trying to do this analysis, I can't keep up. We built out 10 data models to do this at one point, and we realized we needed 80. And probably by the end of that year, we needed, 100 or 1,000. You couldn't keep up. So with big data, with this kind of like, where does big data technology come in and what does it mean? Is that, big data kind of originated in search, right? Google kind of started it, Yahoo added to it. It's been kind of almost productionalized now so that companies can consume it. But basically what it does is it allows you to ingest large amounts of data in multi-structured environments and bring that into your organization on technology that's cheap enough to store some of this. And then it allows you to open up new analytics. So the big driver for companies to deal with this is this concept of data velocity. You have data coming from all these different sources outside the company. It's coming in at rates they could never even handle. And I'll give you an example. I was working with one of the major cable companies, and they're used to, they had about 22 million customers, so they sent out about 22 million bills a year, or 22 million bills a month, I'm sorry. Surprisingly, they would actually talk to about 20 million customers a month in their call centers. So it's almost one-to-one. They almost talked to everybody every month. They also had display ads on their email website. So their IT department was used to sending out 20 million bills. They were used to handling about 20 million calls. They were contacting about 15 million customers a month with direct marketing. And they were actually placing about 6 billion ads a month as people were opening emails. They didn't know what to do with that data. It's 6 billion impressions every month that just were sitting out in some silo that they didn't know what to do with. So it's a very big difference between how companies are used to dealing with data and being able to deal with that effectively. So the first thing we tell clients to do is really kind of quantify this world around you. What are the things that you're really interested in? How do you accelerate those insights for your business? And then kind of capture that opportunity. So how do you capture that opportunity? Well, the first is really kind of thinking about the value of data. So thinking about all these different places where you can bring data in, and some of the big drivers are geolocation. That's obviously going to be a key data point that people are kind of centering their thought process on. Where am I at this moment in space and time? your basic demographic information is still usable, but I think that as you tie that to social relationships and the interest that you state in a social environment, those start to become much more powerful, because I'm not just wondering what you're doing at this moment. I have a better understanding of what you've been doing and where you've been. And then as you take like smartphone data or things that you've previously bought or financial transactions that people have access to, I can create this relatively robust view that has to be sitting there at the moment that you're interested. But as I do that, I start to create new value from the data because I'm bringing it all together. And I think we get caught up with big data with this idea of volume being a big driver. Volume is obviously important because this is different scale than most organizations are used to. But really, the value is that you're kind of transforming the data. And as you transform the data from kind of its raw state to start processing it, it's almost like oil to some extent, where the oil has way more value when you're putting it in your car than when you take it out of the ground. And you have to do a lot of stuff to get that data there. But the value of the data at the top end of this pyramid grows exponentially. So the first places we saw this was in search, is being able to take that data and transform it and make it usable and make it consumable and drive not just a great customer experience, but also a valuable marketing experience. And we saw that kind of expand into online shopping, eBay, Amazon, others. You see social kind of adopting, has turned that same approach, but we're seeing it expand into a lot of different areas and finer and finer levels of detail. So whether it's insight or retail insight or financial institutions or small business marketing, the companies are transforming data and being able to bring that together. So I have this large velocity of data that's scooting around. I have technologies or companies that are out there transforming and creating value from that data. And really now, for the first time, I actually have a way to consume that as a company. The first big kind of change is being able to deal with multi-structured data. And without getting into, I try not to be too, it has all these like different pictures of these silly made-up animals. But if you get like, there's technologies like Hadoop that allow you to just bring the data in its raw format. If you're in a typical IT environment where it's running relational database, you might spend 3 or 4 months mapping the data before you even load it into your system. The idea of being able to get value out of that is impossible. So what the search companies perfected was the ability to load data in very quickly in its raw format and then use it as you need it. Now companies can do that too. The second is there's new economics in this space. So previously, in order to have a large system, you had to have huge budgets. We had one client that came to us and said, we can't ingest all the data that we want to because of your pricing. They said, for us to bring in all the data we want would cost us $80 billion over the next 10 years, and we're not going to spend $80 billion with you. Surprisingly, that was kind of disappointing news. But they are like, we may spend several $100 million, but we got to change the dynamics of the economics. So what the technologies like MapReduce and Postgres databases allow you to do in the big data space is to bring large amounts of data into the company on commodity hardware at a much lower price point. Instead of going out and buying what's known as like a kind of traditional large relational databases, my former employer Teradata, one of those, I can now bring it in at a tenth of the cost. So there's whole economics around that, and I don't have to organize it first. So I'm saving time and I'm saving money. And then the third thing is there's this kind of global data fabric where I can push data to wherever I need it to be. Previously, the data kind of sat in one place. You couldn't really consume it, you couldn't really reach customers as they were in the process of doing things. And now with this kind of global data fabric, you have, through mobile devices, you have the ability to bring this data to them and create value from that data at the moment they need it. So what that underlying framework does of technologies, the big data technologies, is really creates an analytics revolution. And I'll be the first to tell you, there's almost no value in servers, there's almost no value in databases. That doesn't drive value to the customer. The only place you start to get value is when you get analytics and new analytics that they can transform how you're dealing with customers. And this is, I think, probably the most exciting area in the big data space. So, these are some really kind of, I like this slide because it does two things. One, it really kind of sets your mind where you need to be thinking, which is data liberation, fluidity, things like that. But at the same time, how do you actually create that fluidity of data? How do you have rich data environments? So I want to kind of step down into a couple examples in the analytics space to kind of show how this works. The first, and I think, if you're in the search world, text analytics have been, kind of the key driving capability of search engine marketing, search optimization, and even site search. What are people transforming what people say in that little box into something that provides useful results at a very high level? Now, if I take that same capability and I can deploy it easily within my organization, what analytics can I do? And I'll tell you, when you start having that conversation, we're at the very beginning stages with most IT organizations, even most marketing organizations, because that text data was just blobs. Nobody ever really looked at it. If you think about every time you call into customer service, they say, oh, this call may be monitored or recorded. They do, they record it. And they store it, and they never, ever listen to it. There's just too much of it. But as you start being able to do analysis around word frequency, the distance, being able to assign passion or interest, or being able to see how people talk about things over time, it really has a lot of value. So the first area that you want, as somebody's coming through your site, you think about the search string that got them to the site. Think about the things they searched on the site. How have they refined those two areas? So as you tie search, the search engine area to the site search, how are they refining how they're thinking about it? Can you then use that in your marketing? It's like almost free marketing research because people are telling you what they want. There's also, same information applies to any data that's collected throughout the process that previously was just call center notes, for instance. Nobody ever paid attention to that. Chat sessions. How do people talk about the product? How do they talk about their experience? And can you change that? So one client, I just heard this story yesterday. They had to analyze people who came to their site, paid their bill, and then called customer care. And they couldn't figure out why were they calling customer care. Why would somebody go to the site, pay their bill, and then call care? It doesn't make any sense. But it costs $5 every time that happens. And when you have 100 million customers, and that happens a few times a month, the cash register is just constantly ringing. It's like being in a taxi that's kind of stuck in traffic. And it turned out they would send people texts and say, you need to pay your bill in 2 hours or we're going to shut down your service. And the person would take that and they would go to the site and they would pay their bill, and the payment system would say, thank you, we'll process your payment within 24 hours. And people would go, wait a second, I don't want to lose my service, I just paid my bill. And they would pick up the phone and call service, the care people, and say, hey, can you make sure I don't lose my phone service for the next 22 hours? They weren't going to shut off their phone after they made the payment. They just were trying to manage people's expectations, and they did it badly, resulting in extra costs. But they couldn't find that information previously until they actually analyzed what the web pages that people saw said. Until those words popped up, they couldn't see that. They saw it in the text, and then they were able to find it on the pages. And they had that in because they were using kind of big data technologies to analyze text. The other really interesting area, and I think this falls a little bit more outside of search typically, but is key to the purchase path, is time series analysis. So one of the key things that big data platforms have done is given you this kind of data liberation. Whenever I previously stored data, I would store it by account number, I'd store it by product, I'd store it by SKU, I'd store it by anything except seconds, date, time, down to the second. But now I can actually because I'm bringing the data together in a big data environment, I don't have to index those fields first. I can ask the question, and I can tie this data together in a long string. I was talking to one client yesterday who's tied together the last 49 interactions they had with customers. So they could pick an event and go back 49 steps, and they can look and see every time that person came to the site, what did they search on? Every time they used social to come to the site, things that they liked, you can pick up, they were able to pick up 49 events and analyze those visually across time series using different graphic techniques. And by being able to visualize these time series, we're kind of transforming how we think about that customer journey. We always knew there was a customer journey going through those 5 steps. We could never see what actually happened. Now I can go through and I can see all my customers as they go through these different areas, through the different steps along the process to either purchase or churn or any event I want to do. So I can pick an event, find the customers that had that event, and map backwards all the steps that took them there. So I can actually see customers, in many cases, who bought in a store, had a used search outside of that store purchase, and kind of to be able to tie those together. And then the last kind of big data technology thing I want to talk about is this idea of kind of graph analytics. And it's really about connections of things as opposed to thinking about the data being in rows and columns and an Excel spreadsheet. As the data is kind of loaded in these data blobs without being structured, I can actually write queries using some of the big data technologies to extract this data and connect this data in ways I could never do it before. So just to give you an example, and this is one that has stuck with me for work that was done with the client, was market basket analysis. This is the same thing as connecting people, it's just I'm connecting products. This was a large retailer. Previously, they were able to connect, they would look at like 17 weeks of data was the most they ever did, and they would do it at the group level. So they could see people who bought fruit, and people who bought dairy, and maybe people who bought meat. That was like, and they could see 17 weeks of that. Well, that's interesting, but it's not all that helpful because 17 weeks, I can't do any seasonality. So I'm gonna have to compare the last 17 weeks to 17 weeks a year ago, and it's all kind of clunky, right? With one of the big data appliances, they were able to look at 8 years of data at the SKU level. So they knew that you bought bananas, and they knew that you bought low-fat milk. And they were able to see now baskets that changed over time that maybe previously had, they could see that not that you bought diapers, but that your sizes of diapers were getting bigger and bigger to the point where you no longer needed diapers. So they could actually predict when you would not need diapers. I think if you look at the story of the Target story where the young girl was 17-year-old was pregnant. Her father called up and said, "Why are you advertising pregnancy stuff to my daughter?" To the local Target manager. And a couple weeks later, he called back and said, "Obviously, there were some things going on in my house I didn't know about," because Target knew this girl was pregnant based on her purchase, based on her market basket. The things she was putting in her basket indicated that she would be interested in other pregnancy-related items. And that ability to kind of tie people, items into different analytic capability, into different analytic viewpoints is critical, is one of the critical things that comes out of the big data technologies. Being able to take decision trees and then finding the single shortest path to those decisions allows you to kind of map how people are going through your day, going through their experience. And so when we're talking about, at the beginning, when I was showing you, how do I tie supply chain to search? Is that important? Now I can actually analyze and see where I can do that. And then I can develop algorithms that programatize that. If I wanted to see how my advertising campaigns tie to in-store traffic and I want to use search as a linchpin in there, I can do that. And those are the types of analytics I think that become kind of really critical in thinking about the big data space. Not necessarily the velocity is important, the volume and velocity, yeah, that's important. but that's a driver of change. The value of data means that we can actually spend more time, more money on it. And this new economics allows us to actually do it at a reasonable price point within the budget of a company. And then this kind of revolution in analytics is allowing us to drive forward. So the last thing I want to talk about is like really kind of quickly is seeing this kind of play out. And this, I tried to be a little provocative with this because I think there is something here. This is a made-up case study, but it actually is it's based on reality. So if you think about the CMO office, they have to do stuff that's going to show up in 250 milliseconds to people, and search has always been able to manage that. That is like, I think, the coolest competitive advantage of search over all the other marketing channels, which is you guys are positioning the information there. When I need it, it's there right away, right? It's total pull down, it's available. So when I'm going through this cycle, I can, that seek value is really critical. But what if you rethink of this, and what if you think about how would I avoid that step of seeking information? So I'm going to show you a case study that is based on some work that's being done today. So thinking about social media and the monitoring that's going on, a lot of times it just gets spit out into infographics and after the fact things that are going on, and that's pretty interesting, but it doesn't really change how I go to market in that 250 milliseconds. This was some work that we did for the rugby, Six Nation Rugby Championship. But when you think about tying that social monitoring to this handset, I have a friend, Christian Howes, and he started saying like, that makes everybody cyborgs. And you can actually see him on the telly in the UK. He does social analytics for, I think, Fear Factor, things like that in the UK. But as you think about it, tying that demographic data that we've always had within the firewall to mobile content, location, advertising, and viewership information, as well as social activities, is really powerful. Now, the best way I think to explain this is to put it in a box, right? So you take all this information, you take your social, you take your mobile, and put it in a box. Put it into an event, like Coors Field in Denver, where you get the benefit of having snowouts in April and snowouts in October. But anyway, so you think about Coors Field, people are coming to the game. So I can bring this information because I've pre-positioned it together, and I know based on this information, I might even know who's coming to the game. If I'm a carrier, I can see that phone going through my network and showing up at Coors Field. And when they get there, they're looking for parking. So I can tell them where the parking is. I know that they tend to get there late because I can see when they're parking, I can see when they're going to get there, and I can tell them, hey, here's where to get a beer on the way to your seat. I know that, there's some, first couple of innings have been going really well. I don't need to touch them. But I can then say, hey, there's no line at this hot dog stand. And I can go through the whole game and kind of position what they might want at any time because, and this was a really fascinating thing I heard. It was about conferences, and somebody was talking about conferences in general, and they were talking to the staff at, I think it was it was kind of some weird movie conference that people were going to. But the people that worked there said, conferences have this ebb and flow. People do the same thing. They show up on Sunday, and they have a certain attitude, they do certain things, they show up on Tuesday. You go through the conference and there's a flow to it, and it happens week after week, and you can start mapping it within these events. People are going to buy hot dogs here, they're going to buy ice cream here. They might donate to a charity, if the team is winning. You can actually see these things happening. And then at the end of the game, I might tell you where to get gas. Or I might know that you came from outside the company, from outside Colorado, and I can send you information I know where you're going to go, and I can push information to you across that. So instead of you pulling it down by doing search and saying, how do I get to Estes Park, Colorado, because I want to go to Rocky Mountain National Park, I can actually guess which customers are going to do that. And when Craig had suggested I do this presentation, he said, you should just start with Minority Report and just run a clip of Minority Report about predetermination, because this is actually happening. There's actually products out there that people can buy for events that allow you to select a target group of people and target them throughout this and track those people as they see sponsorships. Do they show up at those sponsors? Do they actually activate them? And so I just wanted to kind of wrap this setup with kind of like, where does the next $1 billion come from? Where does the next $100 million idea come from? And when we think about big data, we have this like kind of like traditional analytics space down here in the corner, and we could do some really cool stuff. But as long as everybody's doing things in silos, if you're just looking at the search silo, if you're just looking at the social silo, if you're just looking at the mobile silo, it never really allows you to expand out into all these other areas and really optimize new things that you can do within the marketing organization, within the purview of the CMO to drive, $100 million, $1 billion ideas. So that was my last slide. I know I went through that very quickly, but does anybody have any questions? Oh, he's going to bring you a mic.
Hi, thanks for coming. Lori Sullivan.
Oh, nice to meet you, Lori.
Nice to meet you. I wanted to ask you about time. I thought it was really interesting. Will features like maybe like the Facebook timeline and things like that play into this whole thing about time?
Yes, I think, and Twitter's a little bit easier. I'll just start with Twitter if that's okay, because Twitter's mostly public. So when people have asked me about what to do with social, I always try to go to Twitter because it's public and it's easier. You don't get into all the craziness of Facebook. But if you can bring in that Twitter information, social is not massively unstructured. It's almost like search, right? There's a little bit that's unstructured. How people tweet, what they put on their timeline, what they search for. There's a little bit that's unstructured. The rest of it is highly structured data. We know the time, we know who did it, we probably know where they were. I think there's 133 fields that surround a single tweet that you can then tie together. And so because of Twitter data, I can then ingest the Twitter fire hose and tie that into my database very easily. There's a lot of tools to do that. Facebook's slightly more complicated because there's a lot more offerings in Facebook and there's a lot more different privacy settings. And I may have my own corporate site, but I have full access to everything that's posted, and I can use the Facebook timeline in that regard. The communications between me and my family, I don't have access to that. All I know is I placed ads on those pages, but I can then see when those ads were placed. I can then also probably see some of the social search graph that's being developed that I think will have a lot of ramifications in the future. Any other questions?
No? Well, great. Thank you, Paul. So coming up next, we have Jeremy Kagan, professor of marketing at Columbia. Wanted him to come up on stage and bring his panel up and let him introduce them to discuss products listing ads and what commerce and search can learn from each other.